You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier.
Robert Lawrence Kuhn is the creator, writer, host, and executive producer of Closer to Truth, the PBS public television series on cosmos, consciousness, and meaning that presents leading scientists, philosophers, and creative thinkers discussing fundamental questions. Dr. Kuhn has published over 30 books, including The Mystery of Existence, Why Is There Anything at All?, with John Leslie, and Closer to Truth, Challenging Current Belief. He is a featured expert voice on Space.com. He is an international corporate strategist and investment banker with a BA in human biology from Johns Hopkins and a PhD in anatomy and brain research from UCLA. Robert Lawrence Kuhn, welcome to the program.
Pleasure to be here, John.
Now, Robert, you began long ago in neuroscience, and one of the themes of Closer to Truth is consciousness and what consciousness is. Are we any closer from when you started to now to actually understanding the mystery of human consciousness, or are we still just completely mystified?
There are two answers to that question, and it is yes and no. If I compare what we know about how the brain works with direct relationship to our conscious experience between when I started my doctoral program at UCLA, which at that time, it was at the Brain Research Institute. At that time, it was the only Brain Research Institute, which was cross-disciplinary in the U.S. Now there are dozens of them, of course. To what we know today, the progress has been spectacular in terms of how things work in relationship to elements of consciousness. On the other hand, if we want to ask about the fundamental mystery of inner self-awareness, what Dave Chalmers calls the hard problem, I'd say there is a difference of opinion. I would skew to where we're not a lot closer on that, but we much more deeply understand the nature of that question. So to be very precise in terms of the biological elements that are constituent of the conscious experience, we are greatly more enlightened. And on the nature of inner experience itself, we understand the nature of that question much more finely than we did decades ago. That doesn't mean we're any closer to a conclusion about what actually that consciousness is, but it does give me a kind of a different kind of appreciation to where I'm not uncomfortable kind of dealing with the great mystery of consciousness, because I so richly understand the nature of that question through a lot of the great advances made by philosophers and scientists who take the issue of consciousness and human consciousness very seriously.
Now, in terms of consciousness, could it be said that there is a possible separation between the brain, as we see it, and the mind, which may not be the same thing, or they're obviously related, but they may be different? Do we think that we can say that the mind is entirely contained within the human brain, or are there things like near-death experiences and things like that that maybe suggest there might be a little bit more?
Well, this is the fundamental classical mind-body problem that has always existed, and there are many expressions of it. Some that I've used recently are questions of AI consciousness. Will super AI, however super you want to go into the future, what Ray Kurzweil and others call the singularity, when artificial intelligence vastly exceeds human intelligence, will that entity, under any conditions, be conscious in terms of having an inner experience? That's number one. Number two, another question is of what has been called virtual immortality. where you will be able to upload your first-person experiential self to non-physical media and live forever or as long as that media can exist in the universe as we know it. A third question is also one that I've posed, is that people talk about exploring the universe through robotic probes, so-called von Neumann probes that can self-duplicate, and eventually you can colonize the galaxy and ultimately the universe in some sense. How important would that be if those probes are conscious or not conscious? I think that's a fundamental question. So what I'm saying is the question you're asking about brain and mind and what that is has very broad implications. And the more we explore and more we advance, the more we see how important this question is. So in terms of the nature of human sentience, I can't think of any question more important than the question you have asked it very cogently and simply: is there a difference between brain and mind? I might also add the question of ultimate existence. What's that? Why is there something rather than nothing? But those would be the two ultimate kinds of questions. Now, how then do you address these issues? I'm a little wary of using near-death experiences as a primary tool for addressing this question, and that's a whole other issue we can discuss. But there's been terrific work and thought over the years in understanding what that may mean. And so the way I address it, without giving you an answer to that, is there a difference between brain and mind? Because on one level, obviously, there's a difference. You're using different terms to express something. One is expressed in the terms of neuronal impulses or synaptic neurochemicals floating back and forth, electromagnetic waves in the brain at different frequencies. That's the language of the brain. The language of the mind are, whatever you want to call it: love, awareness, sensations, all of the things that we talk about the mind. So on the surface, they are radically different. Now, the implication among materialists, of course, is that they are the same thing, much as the evening star and the morning star are different names for the same physical thing, which is, the planet Venus, described in different ways, or H2O and the word water. They are the same thing. They're referring to the same object, the same thing, but they're using different conventions in order to get there. And so, superficially, brain and mind are different by what I said, but that does not address the issue of whether they fundamentally are pointing to the same objects. Now, to get to the next, to start addressing that question, are they referring to the same object? Is a bigger question. And first of all, that designation is what I generally call identity theory. That says what you call the mind and what somebody else calls the brain are referring to the same thing, and so they are identical. And I think one of the challenges of every single explanation of consciousness is the identity theory challenge, because at the end of the day, no matter what you say consciousness is or caused by, you have to say, you are saying, in fact, that that whatever you think is the cause of consciousness is, capital I-S, is consciousness. And that's always a challenge. Now, the way I try to address the question is to give a spectrum of ways of thinking about consciousness, and both as mechanisms and possible ways it happens, without trying to choose my favorite, but rather to list this spectrum And of course, we have to do it linearly because we speak in linear terms in a conversation or on paper. But they obviously have different kinds of relationships. So linearity is not necessarily does not convey some deeper meaning. But we have to start someplace. So if I have this spectrum, I would start with the most physical and end with the least physical or most non-physical. And so what would you do in this spectrum? And I'll just throw out what I've done, how I've done this. And the other, there's no magic to it. There's other ways to do this. So I would start, number one, with pure physicalism or materialism, sometimes called eliminative, which is a subset of that. Physicalism, which basically denies that there is any sense of consciousness. I think there are different ways that people do that. I know Dan Dennett, for example, has been often accused of denying consciousness, which everybody would say is self-contradictory. But I think his position is actually more sophisticated than that, and that he makes a legitimate argument. I may not agree with the conclusion, but it's a legitimate argument, and it's not easily dismissed. So physicalism would start at the one that's only physical. We may not understand how it all works, but there's absolutely nothing exists that is in our mind, to use that term, that cannot be explained ultimately in our brain. Second, I would call epiphenomenalism, which says that consciousness or mind is something different, but it's something that emerges, it floats on the physicals. Supervenes the term that's used, but the epiphenomenal means that the consciousness seems that it's independent and real, but it really isn't. The analogy that's often used is the foam on the waves. The waves are the energy, from the tides of the moon, causing the foam. But the foam has its own sense, but it is just it is not causing the waves, or it may look like it's causing the waves, but it's not. It's just sort of an independent result of something else that's happening that gives you the illusion that there's cause there. Then moving along, the next one I would have is what has been called non-reductive physicalism, and this is increasingly popular among scientists who who want to remain purely physical, but yet can't deal with some of the issues of mind that are difficult to understand in terms of this raw identity theory. It's also popular among some religious philosophers, particularly in the Christian tradition, who have moved away from an immortal soul for various reasons, but want to preserve some kind of aspect of a higher level mentality than just the pure physicalism, which would undermine their theologies. I've always been a little leery of this, to give my opinion, in terms of an explanation, because it seems to embed some contradictions. It has to have some kind of a strong emergence where you could never predict by lower levels what's happening at the upper levels. But I want to give it credit as being an increasing mechanism or idea that has been adopted by different kinds of people. Then moving along, again, this is linear, but they're not exactly. Quantum consciousness, which we know Roger Penrose and Hameroff have been the proponents of over the years, and this basically calls consciousness non-computational. And looks to the inner workings of cells, aspects of cells that can operate in quantum states, and that through this quantum interaction, it's a different level of how the universe works. And of course, the criticisms of it are easy. You have two mysteries in the world. How does quantum theory work? How does consciousness work? So you solve them as if two simultaneous equations. The challenge has been how could quantum theory work in the brain on such a macro level, where it's a hot, wet environment. Max Tegmark had a well-known paper years ago showing that that would be impossible. And yet there have been some recent discoveries in biology and from everything from photosynthesis to others to how birds navigate, which seems to show some quantum activities that are happening in our brain. So one cannot easily dismiss this, and needs to consider it as a serious attempt to deal with the issue. Then moving along, I actually divided the next one into which I use the word qualia, which is of course this inner sense that we have, this inner awareness. And I divided it into two, and I made them because I think this is an important one. So the first I call a qualia force, which says there is something in reality that is not derived from the fields of fundamental physics, some unknown aspect of the world that has some fundamental physical property, like a fifth force or something, and compared to the four forces we know. Next one I call qualia space, which says that there's a whole level of reality in some hyperdimensional sense that, but still within the realm of the physical world. We're not dealing with gods or souls or spirits or ghosts or anything. We're still dealing with the way reality is constructed. In Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, which has a lot of scientific underpinnings to it. And when you push him a lot, which I like to do, he sort of wonders if there is not this sort of independent space in which consciousness and conscious experiences and conscious whole images are reflected by some structural way. So, that to me is an interesting and revelatory idea. It may not be right. It probably isn't right, but nonetheless, it's a way of expanding our thinking. Then I go on to panpsychism, which has become increasingly popular, which says that in order to have this inner sense of consciousness, you must have consciousness built into the fundamental realities of the world. So everything that exists, well, it's a physical field or a particle that emerges from it, has some kind of proto-consciousness as part of it. And so then it's built together. There's a combination problem. How do you have a lot of little tiny proto-consciousness kind of combined into some consciousness that we know, but people try to deal with that. This actually goes back to pre-modern animistic religions that sort of have imagined this way, but it's increasingly popular among philosophers, and that's interesting. And then the last two, which we don't spend a lot of time on, dualism, which says that in order to sustain consciousness, you must have an independent existence. So the real world is made up of two fundamental categories: a real physical world and a real non-physical world, non-physical substance of some kinds. If you had an immortal soul, it would fit in there. If you had some kind of spirit of who knows what. A lot of different traditions have different ways of expressing it, but it's two kinds of realities that obviously have to work together in some sense, which is another problem. But the two realities, which is a traditional way of thinking, and most common people would actually believe this right now. There are a lot of issues with it as well. And then the final category is where consciousness is not something to be explained. Conscious is what is the fundamental reality. It's the ultimate reality. It's the only thing that exists. Conscious, and this is idealism in philosophers. It's cosmic consciousness, particularly in Eastern traditions, and it has an increasing following as well. That consciousness is not something we need to explain from the physical reality, but the only way to do it is that consciousness is the ultimate, the real reality, and everything else is derived from it. So that's the spectrum. It's a long answer to a simple question, but I don't know any other way how to do it.
Now, in regards to describing the functions of the brain physically, as you noted, some people really want to do that, but there's an impasse, I think, and that is the concept of the present, which doesn't really exist in physics in the framework of general relativity, but it very much exists and is important to consciousness. So do you think that can ever be reconciled? Do you think that physics could actually look at how the human brain sees the present and actually figure out what it is?
So we're now trying to deal with the nature of time using fundamental physics and the perception of time using, cognitive psychology in a sense, and how those two could relate. So I think to begin to do this, we need to look at each one of those independently and see what the elements of each are. So in physics, time is different in general relativity and in quantum theory. So one of the challenges in reconciling the two, which every physicist say is an exception, with the exception being Freeman Dyson, who was a wonderful thinker par excellence in so many ways. When I posed this question to him some, 12 years ago when we interviewed him, he said, well, maybe you don't have to reconcile quantum theory with general relativity, with his inimitable smile. But again, every other physicist say we do. But if we do, we have to deal with time, because time is definitely different in the two theories. And so time within physics has its own issues of how we deal with it. And there are substantial thinkers on both sides in terms of the importance of time. I'd say moving towards where time is less critical. There are many individuals who think, time is an illusion that is psychologically imposed on a timeless physics. But that is controversial itself. So that's on the one side. On the other side, we know well from a cognitive psychology point of view that our perceptions of time are radically different and will be altered very easily by all sorts of human interactions or experiments in psychology. So now to put them together and ask whether the nature of and then we should add a third, which is philosophical nature of time. So we have the physics, quantum physics, general relativity conundrum with time. We have the perceptions, psychological perceptions, cognitive psychology of time. Then we have the philosophy of time with, A and B time, and whether time really passes or whether we could only have sequence of events and tense time and non-tense time and all of that, just an order or actual hardwired time. And, you have different theories. So presentism in philosophy says that only the present is real, which is this fleeting moment of that psychologically may be measured in fractions of a second, but could be measured in however small you want to get. What is the present? And that the future and the past don't exist. And then, of course, other people say that everything exists in a block universe and come up with different explanations. But none of that is definitive. So we have this kind of orthogonal three kinds of approaches to time in physics, in cognitive psychology, and in philosophy. So I would, at this point, not be willing to make what I believe to be the fundamentals of consciousness dependent upon what time is. I think, but when you would have an explanation of consciousness, if that's ever possible, or as you narrow alternatives, you will need to explain time within that context. So maybe that's a kind of a cheating answer, but it says I'm not using time to assess my theories of consciousness, but if I have a theory of consciousness, I must be able to explain time in its context.
Now, do you think that certain mysteries of the brain can be explored scientifically? And we mentioned the NDE, near-death experiences, but there's also things like, for example, lucidity, in in patients that are afflicted with Alzheimer's and things like that, and then all of a sudden they regain lucidity, rarely, not long before death, and all sorts of these mysteries about the mind. Do you think that science can make inroads in actually measuring and figuring out what these are and what they mean?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think the answer to that, which will be my first time I'm giving you a definitive answer, is yes, that we can do that. I give you personal examples because I went through this with my mother, who died 2 years ago, a week before her 102nd birthday, so no complaints. But she was an extremely verbal, proud woman who, came through the Depression the poorest ways and fought her way up. And I said if she would have been a corporate executive or a great lawyer, if she didn't have to start working at 16, she was head of her class. And anyway, so she went through her life, and in the last, I'd say, 5 years, she began to develop a kind of dementia. And in the last year or two, it was pretty severe, so where she wouldn't be talking at all. And so she'd go months without talking. And then suddenly, the caregiver, she was in assisted living, told me that one day she just looked up at everybody and said, in perfectly formed sentences, loud and with a strong voice, she said, "It's not that I don't want to talk anymore. It's that I don't want to talk to any of you at all." And then she went back into silence. And everybody just cracked up. And it was perfectly formed sentence. And one time she did something similar to me, and this was a little earlier. She was a little bit more fluent, not speaking, and I would be sitting there for a while. And of course, I'm not just looking at the wall. I'm on my computer working on Closer to Truth or whatever. And this started to irritate my mother that I was with her and not paying attention to her as opposed to my computer. Well, she wasn't talking, so I didn't know what to do, and I wanted to stay there. And then she said, again loud to where the whole room heard her, she said, "With all that junk you do on your computer, at least are you making any money?" So that to me is proof positive that even though she was consumed by dementia to where she wouldn't talk for weeks on end at all, that this did totally distinguish herself, because both of those little stories I told you were a perfect representation of her personality. I mean, though that was spot on her personality. So that was all there. And could science be able to distinguish, where those memories and where that personality was embedded, what kind of neuronal circuitry, what type of synaptic impressions, what type of broad electromagnetic waves were constituent of that personality, and how they were suppressed by the protein builds up or whatever that was building up in the brain, or demyelinization, whatever it was that was causing the dementia, how those elements were still preserved in some way. So the ability of neuroscience to really get in and be able to make these kinds of analyses is, to me, very strong, and I would look for more progress. Now, when you go to another question of near-death experiences, I think that's a different category of analysis. I've actually been criticized, more than once, by not dealing extensively with near-death experiences on Closer to Truth in consciousness. We mentioned a little bit, but not much. And I can discuss the reason why for that. So, because if you are trying to explain near-death experiences in a physical sense, that is obviously doable. So a lot of people have theories for that, none definitive, but a lot of theories. But if you want to make the case that the evidence that near-death experiences produces are demonstrations, if not proofs, of non-physical existence of some element of consciousness or the mind, or a dissociation or life after death or something, that's a big leap. That's a giant leap. And I think it's an open question whether science can address that at all. I mean, there have been some attempts to do that non-successfully, in my opinion. Um, but I don't. My opinion right now is that science would not have a capacity to ultimately address that kind of question, because there'll always be another way to explain something. Um, than the way you may want to see it. But this is and again, it seems to be an increasingly interesting area for many people. I have found it less interesting, but I'm being provoked, so on many sides, so maybe we'll try to address that at some point. But I find it less interesting because I don't see how significant progress has been made or even can be made.
Now, truth, to switch gears a bit. Closer to Truth, which is one of the best names for a television show I've ever heard. Now, it's been made, the point has been made that truth and fact are two different things, and that there can be a fundamental truth that doesn't exactly connect up with what we know as fact. And an example of this would be, I suppose, like fine tuning, which is a question that you've covered extensively in the show, about the fine tuning of the universe and how a whole bunch of factors have to be just so for any part of this universe to be habitable. And actually, you could even make the argument that a whole bunch of things have to be just so that matter itself can exist in this universe.
That's absolutely right.
Do you think this leads to a certain truth about the universe, that maybe we will never fully understand the facts of the universe and its workings, but maybe we can understand a truth about it, if that makes sense?
That's a very good question. I think it does make sense. You've packed a lot into that question, and I'm going to start with a very simple story, because I'm going to tell you the story of how Closer to Truth got that name. When I originally had the idea for the television series, it started in the 1980s, late 80s. I had the idea for a series called When Truth May Change, because I wanted to look at areas of science and human knowledge that had a kind of a paradigm shift or a breakthrough, and to look at the elements of what caused that. Well, the exigencies of life inhibited me from doing that. And then in the late 90s, so 10 years later or something, a friend of mine had some studio time, and he and I worked together, and I created a prototype for a show that focused a lot on the human mind and brain consciousness, what we've been talking about. And I called the show Mind Quest, and it went nowhere. And then in 1997, in the local PBS station in Orange County, where I was working at the time, the new president, Mel Rogers, I give him credit as being the godfather of Closer to Truth, took a chance and saying, let's do a prototype, a pilot. I'm not going to broadcast it, but let's just see how it works and try to see it. But he said, I can't stand that title, Mind Quest. He said, it's too agey, whatever it is. And he said, tell me what it's about. And I said, well, the tagline for Mind Quest was, this is the closest you'll get to truth. And he said, that's the title, the closest you'll get to truth. And then I jumped up and I said, no, not closest, because I really don't know that. It's closer. It's a process. And it's not the truth. It can't be the truth. We got to take the out. Closer to truth. And, immediately we agreed on that. And then very long process to get the show started, but, that's another story. We had the first versions in 2000, another in 2003. They were roundtables. And then when Peter Getzels and I met in 2006 together, and he did a great deal of the visual imagery and the conceptual of the show, we created what it is today. But when people write, and they often write, to us, and they say, talk about it, they like closer to the truth. I always correct them. I said, it's not closer to the truth, it's closer to truth, which is a big part of our kind of DNA. And in fact, we capitalize the word to, T-O, because it's not a trivial word. To indicates process. So it's a process of getting closer to truth. So that's the introduction now. How to deal with the nature of truth versus facts. We're dealing with a kind of problem of semantics with the English language, because all of these words have so many connotations to them as well as denotations, that it's really impossible to kind of nail it down. But to go back to your original conjecture about can you have a truth without knowing all the facts about the universe? I think that's I hadn't thought of it that way. That's interesting, but I think there's some truth in that. I think that that as we discern all the things we can about the universe and about physics and mathematics and our own sentience with all the explorations we do, we're getting a greater feel for what is the nature of reality. And philosophers talk about the state of affairs, which means everything that exists, all reality, combine it into one. We say the universe, that's a subset of the total state of affairs, or what all reality is, because there may be other aspects to it that are mental expressions of what we have, or it could be non-physical realities that are posed by philosophers or theology or whatever. And one thing I'm reasonably confident of is that if there are such realities, that the scientific method per se will not be able to get at them in a definitive sense. It's almost a tautology, almost by definition. But that doesn't give an excuse for people to, for anything goes, because science can't address it. That's why I like to distinguish between the scientific method, which is a very precise way and our best way of finding facts, not necessarily finding all truth, but finding all facts by a process of logical thinking, experimental design, repeatability, commonability, in the sense that if a physics experiment, in the U.S. or one in Japan or one in Africa, they're all going to yield the same result. So there has to be commonality, and indeed across the universe is the expectation. And so all of that leads to a definitive way to discern facts. But if we want to say there are larger truths, that doesn't give us an excuse to make up anything. Anything goes. But I call it a scientific way of thinking needs to be applied to truth as well. And that means if you, and so I distinguish between a scientific method per se, which deals with facts of science, and a scientific way of thinking, which is a process to be sure that we are not making leaps over logic without knowing what we're doing. And so when I deal with the meaning or the philosophy of religion part of Closer to Truth, and speak with a lot of philosophers who believe in various non-physical and theological and theistic visions, I'm always careful to make them very very clearly say where the whether it's faith or whether what I call a leap over logic is being made. So I'm perfectly happy with the individuals making those leaps based on whatever motivations they may have, but I just want to be sure they know what they're doing, and we all know what they're doing. And the claim is not for a scientific demonstration of something that is impossible, I think, but rather a way of thinking that brings in other factors that enables them to go from the facts that we all agree upon to the truth that they believe. So I think the distinction is a very important one, and it addresses what I believe is a fundamental premise of how we ought to be thinking, and it's based upon these two concepts. One is a scientific method, which applies to facts, and the other is a scientific way of thinking, or a logical way of thinking, which applies to everything, including truth.
Now, on to the idea of a fine-tuned universe and what truth that might imply. Do you find and I know you've covered both, but do you find the idea that the universe is a single universe and that it just happens to be fine-tuned, do you find that idea more compelling than the somewhat controversial idea of a multiverse, which has the benefit of being able to explain fine-tuning because we just happen to be the lottery winner universe? What argument do you prefer?
Great question. I think it's one of the more important probative questions of reality. We deal with it on Closer to Truth a lot. And I think we need to sketch out what the possible spectrum of how to think about this question. If you let's start with what we believe to be the case. Most people believe to be the case that if there is only one universe, and there are multiple constants of physics which have to be within a certain boundary condition for not just human life to exist, but any matter to exist, or any clumping of galaxies to exist. The large majority of physicists believe that is a question, that is a legitimate question that needs an explanation. There are some physicists who disagree with that, and who would say that the boundaries of the physical constants are sufficiently broad, and that the combination of a titration between a number of them is sufficiently unexplained to where you can have a much broader ways of creating matter and life than presently thought. And the criticism is that if you look at changing only one parameter, yes, it looks like it's fine-tuned, but if you could change simultaneously with the right combination a number of these, you may be able to get some similar effects. Now, that is the minority position, I would say, but it is a position. I think we have to recognize that. So it is not 100% certain that even if we had one universe, there is a serious problem that has to be explained. I think that's the most likely case, that there is a serious problem that needs to be explained. That's my opinion as well, but it's not universally accepted. So that's one. Secondly, to get onto the multiverse, multiverse makes the problem a little easier because you have virtually infinite number, and only in those universes where there is sentient life to ask the question, why does this universe work so well, is the place that is being asked. And it's the analogy there is if when you drive a golf ball 250 yards and it lands on one piece of grass, what were the odds of it landing on that one piece of grass? And you can say, 1 in a trillion, or 1 in a googolplex, whatever you want to say. It's very, very low, but it had to land on some grass, and it's like the lottery winners, et cetera. And so the selection effect is legitimate, that we're only able to ask the question because we're in the one that occurred. And so there's nothing surprising about that. We don't we don't live in the middle of the sun. Why not? Is that a miracle? Well, it's impossible to live our kind of life in the middle of the sun. It has to be where we are now. So there are those kinds of issues. And then on the other hand, even if you have a multiverse, how do you generate a multiverse where at least one of the elements within it will have the characteristics that we need? That is a non-trivial response. So you have to have some universe generating mechanism that whether it's some combination of inflation theory or quantum foam or whatever it is, string theory, to get to that multiverse that can deliver these innumerable universes, one or more of which, we don't know one, but perhaps more, one or more of which has the ability to create substance and matter and ultimately people to ask these questions. So I think the question of fine tuning, which some dismiss as just a kind of an irrelevant kind of canard, kind of imagined by some theologians or something, but I don't think so. I think fine tuning is a very, very good probe of what reality is, what humans' role in the cosmos is in many ways. And I think I personally like to luxuriate in the different explanations of fine tuning, because it enables you to explore all the fundamental nature of quantum physics of this universal string theory to multiple universes, to selection effects, to human sentience, and it's a very, very powerful probe of how to think about the universe and humanity's role in it.
Thanks for listening. I am futurist and science fiction author.
Wrong channel.
No, it's not. Thanks for listening. I am futurist and science fiction author John Michael Gautier, currently hosting Event Horizon and wondering where Anna actually came from. One day I had a tablet computer, the next I had a boss. Very disturbing. And be sure...
And that's enough of that.
YouTuber forever! Like, subscribe, and hit the bell!
Sell out.
What?